Good morning, everybody. My name is Perry Bacon. I'm the host of New Republic's new show about politics and policy. It's called Right Now. And today I'm joined by Lauren Goldstein. She's a pollster at Change Research. She's also has a background, a PhD in political science, specifically political psychology. And we're going to come back to that because it's an important part of the conversation. So welcome, Lauren.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. Well, so here's what I'll start with this broad question. I think I'm told every day, but maybe just every 2 days, that Democrats would win if only, usually this is by a fellow liberal Democrat, Democrats would win elections if only we weren't so woke and focused on identity politics. I am told that by someone every day. Tell me why you and I are skeptical of this. So talk about why.
Sure. Gosh, that's a big question. To try to condense it, I would say, for better or for worse, we have been accused of this for going on 6 decades now. This is an incredibly long-standing narrative that we both take issue with. I would say, in a nutshell, the origins of these disparate positions on matters of wokeness, which, I think we can dispel with the term and just say what we're talking about. We're talking about race and we're talking about racism. The origins really date back to the 60s. That was the point at which the two parties sort of diverged in the public's sort of frame of vision around race and racism, because the Democratic Party under Lyndon Johnson passed landmark civil rights legislation that took important steps towards ending the disenfranchisement of Black voters. That appealed to people who had liberal attitudes about race, white people, and massively repelled white people who held not so liberal attitudes about race. And that started this huge schism. That schism remains incredibly pertinent today, but it reflects a deeply concerted effort on the part of the right to keep this front and center in voters' minds, and to sort of funnel all of that racism through American values, essentially. So this idea of Protestant work ethic, rugged individualism, working hard for everything you have, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, not making excuses. All of this is a carefully crafted narrative that is meant to sort of conceal and smuggle racism into the public and make it palatable and appealing and mainstream and possible to discuss openly without being accused of racism. So this idea that if Democrats were only less woke, they would win elections, this has been kind of a rallying cry for a certain type of moderate commentator or thinker or writer for decades. We have been doing this for decades.
So I would assume the difference. Let me ask you this. You said wokeness and you said race and racism, but you would agree that today, whatever we're talking about includes transgender rights, women's rights. Is it broader than just racism? Is it centered around race and racism, or is it different in the mechanics of the issues today, or really is it about race and racism, but we're pretending that it's broader?
It's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I have a perfect answer to it, in part because, my entire lens on how to interpret politics and how to understand what voters are doing is called symbolic politics, which basically refers to this idea that voters are not highly rational actors who are assembling pro-con lists and deep factual information in order to make decisions. They're reacting to symbols. Racism is a symbol. Wokeness, similarly, is a symbol. There's a reason why, depending on your politics, you might have a really different definition of the word, right? Because it allows people to project. So I would say historically, both in terms of like the origins of the term woke, but also just historically in our politics, it has primarily centered around race and racism. But I would agree that it has broadened to encapsulate other groups, other marginalized groups.
So you're saying it's nothing new. I guess on some level, if it still might be the case that maybe the case is also it has hurt Democrats historically. It's possible that Lyndon Johnson would have won, or the people after Lyndon Johnson would have won more white voters if Lyndon Johnson had not signed the Civil Rights Bill. So are you sort of conceding that being on the quote unquote progressive position on race may have negative effects? You're sort of conceding that a certain way, right?
On a certain level, sure, but we have just as many successes as we have losses when it comes to staking out progressive positions on issues, including race and racism. So it's sort of it's neutralized at the end of the day. I mean, if this were wholly true, we would not have won any elections post 1965. And we've had many victories. And in part, that's because public opinion is thermostatic. So if you have somebody in power who is a raging racist, it's going to repel the public, and they are going to look for some sort of counterbalance in the next election. Typically, that is what happens. Similarly, when we elect a progressive and we see a lot of progressive change, that can sort of spark a backlash and a fear response in the electorate, and they may look for somebody to sort of moderate on those. And in part, this is because most voters are not particularly ideological. They are not sort of principled. They don't have like a deeply coherent, well-reasoned set of beliefs that all fall under a neat umbrella. They're mixed, and things are a lot mushier, for lack of a better word. So I would say, yes, there are circumstances in which racial attitudes have cost Democrats politically. There are also many instances I could name where they have produced big gains that, even if they were not necessarily appreciated in their own time, have come to be things that we really take pride in culturally as a nation.
Explain some of those. What are the sort of benefits of progressive views on progressivism on racial issues specifically, or on wokeness, or on whatever we're talking about here? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think and this is part of the challenge of understanding the intricacies of how these racial attitudes operate, because we have something in the literature that we call the principal implementation gap, which is this idea. Primarily, this is about the study of racial attitudes, but it's this idea that in principle, most people will endorse a high-minded value like equality, racial equality. But when it comes to the implementation, policies, changes, concrete ways in which we would bring that equality about, people express a lot more reticence. So those high-minded values, this idea of racial equality, those are the things that we see pull in the 70s, 80s, and 90s today. But for decades, it has been that way. Things like the 1960s civil rights movement, the 1950s and 1960s, those have become sort of indelible symbols of progress. For the most part, for the vast majority of Americans, they look upon the gains that have come from that era with some sense of national pride and sense that we have corrected an injustice. So there are many examples of racial conflict that was divisive at the time that has come to be lionized in our cultural narrative.
Okay. So we saw 2024 and even 2020, Trump did better with Latino and African American voters than before. I think he might have, particularly 2024. So doesn't that suggest that wokeness is not about race and wokeness has gone too far?
No.
Go ahead.
I would say no, but it's a complicated question. I would say, a few things. Every group swung away from the left in 2024. So to some degree, I think it's a little bit intellectually dishonest to cherry pick a couple of groups and say this is indicative of some broader trend that is, like on a runaway train and going to be very difficult to reverse. He made gains everywhere. He made gains in New York City. Meanwhile, Mamdani just won a Democratic primary. So I would caution that we should not overinterpret or cherry pick a finding and then, focus too much on it. The other is that I would love to see in our public discourse a pivot away from talking just about demographic groups and a deeper appreciation of the fact that we're not talking about racial categories, we're talking about racial attitudes.
Okay.
White people are not the only ones who subscribe to these sort of narratives around American values of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, depending on yourself, rugged independence and self-reliance, Protestant work ethic, all of those things that I mentioned earlier. So it's not necessarily the case that all white people subscribe to the same belief system, and so too do all Black people or all Hispanic people. It's more complicated than that, but there are a lot of aspects of that sort of American mythology around race and racism that members of non-white groups also subscribe to.
In other words, like, so we are polarizing less about like racial voting is in African Americans vote for Democrats is going down. But your point is that basically, if we ask people what they think about Black Lives Matter or immigration, those are capturing racial attitudes. And some African Americans have the conservative view, the anti-immigration view, some Latinos do. And that's where so attitudes about racial issues are not necessarily tied to your race.
They correlate, but they're not, the demographics are not destiny.
Okay. Okay, so I started with the question, which is essentially wouldn't Democrats win if they talked more about sort of the economy and avoided these issues? And I think
Mm.
what I tend to think, and here's what your response is also is that yes, Democrats can talk about the economy more, but politics is a two-sided issue. And actually I would argue Joe Biden did talk about economics a lot, but in reality, Republicans are going to bring up these issues because they think they're good for them to some extent. And so you can't have, if one side is talking about issues of racial attitudes or culture or social issues, you can't duck the subject. In other words, the Democrats have to engage because that's what politics is about, right?
Yes, absolutely. To go silent on something that Republicans are hell-bent on making very salient is not a tactic I would recommend to anybody. It's important to be able to speak to what's salient in the moment. You can't just go silent on issues that you feel don't poll well for you. But the other piece of this puzzle is the fact that, again, too often our narratives, our public discourse sort of separates out the economy from racial issues or from sort of social issues, that wider bucket that contains things like LGBTQ rights. They're not unrelated. And again, this comes back to the symbolic politics. Symbolic predispositions, and that can include things like partisanship, but also your racial attitudes, your attitudes towards other marginalized groups, your attitudes towards women, for example. All of these play on how you interpret current events and so-called objective metrics like the economy. It's a filter. Think of it as like rose-colored glasses. So this idea that the economy is just this like wholly separate issue, this idea that when voters tell us the reason that I voted for Trump is because of the economy. The economy was my main issue. I wasn't concerned about XYZ. I just care about the economy. We can't just take that at face value. Everything that we know about how human beings evaluate information and make decisions in general, but particularly in the political sphere, suggests that all of those symbols are playing deeply on how they interpret something like the economy. The other thing that I would just want to mention, since I have an opportunity to do so, is the economy consistently ranks number one in exit polling for every single presidential election. All of them, going back decades. It is never not important.
Right.
What is particularly salient about the economy in a particular cycle will change. In 2020, it was COVID related, for example. In 2012, it was the recession. And this year it was inflation, this past cycle. So the specifics may change, but the importance of the economy and the fact that voters will consistently say the economy was my number one consideration, that is kind of a fundamental of our political landscape. That was not unique to 2024.
So symbolic politics. So in other words, you're skeptical that people are voting purely on their material conditions. That's what you would say their assessment of their material conditions is related and sort of bound by or bound into with their views on these sort of symbolic issues.
Yeah, I would say that that's half of it. So half of it is that these things interconnect. The other half is that symbolic self-interest is also really pertinent to
Okay.
voters. They may not necessarily be able to fully articulate it because not all of these are like fully consciously formed beliefs. But in addition to the interplay between social attitudes, symbolic predispositions, and economic perceptions and material concerns is symbolic considerations. And that relates to things like your perceived social status and importance in the country. How important is your group? Or is your group threatened by social change? Do you feel deprioritized? Do you feel like you are losing prototypicality? You are no longer perhaps what the average American or the prototypical American looks like in 10, 20, 30 years based on demographic projections of change. And those self-interests are also very important, and they deeply relate to how people make political decisions.
So you're a pollster, but how do we I assume people don't, if you come up to them and ask them in a poll, are you threatened by the number of Latinos who are coming to the country, or the number of women who get promoted to your workplace above you? Or that's what you're getting. That's what you're saying. These things are on people's minds. They're probably not saying those things. They may not, one, they may not be conscious of them. Two, they may know those are not polite things to say in public. So how are you assessing that these things are affecting politics?
Yeah, we're in a strange moment in time because, the period of time that I was in graduate school and I was being trained on all of these things, it was very much about uncovering beliefs that people, due to social desirability constraints, would not own up to explicitly, but that we needed to sort of circumvent some of those guardrails in order to measure accurately. I would say the landscape right now is a lot more mixed. Some of these beliefs people do own up to fairly explicitly around, whether, you know, w- women's progress and feminism has gone too far or is costing the country in some way, or is harming men in some way. Some of these beliefs people will cop to pretty explicitly. Others we do have to circumvent and be careful with. So sticking with gender as an example, I find that like one of the least useful questions I can ask, and so I don't ask it, when it comes to assessing how gender biases may impact people's vote choice. It is not useful to ask a question like, would you vote for a woman?
Mhm.
Um, that one
Everyone
is
says yes.
Everyone says yes. Virtually everybody says yes. We don't get any purchase out of that question. But when we ask some more abstract questions about like women's role in society, that often is a place where we can detect a little bit more willingness to be explicit. And those attitudes, when we look at how they relate to vote choice, have a lot more explanatory power. So sometimes it's about sort of abstracting away from the political context, and appreciating how people view culture. And sometimes it's about using measures that are not explicitly asking people about race and are more, again, trying to probe racial attitudes that get masked with American values. Things like, other minority groups besides Black people came to this country and worked their way up with no special favors. So Black people should do the same thing. That is one of the 4 items we use to measure anti-Black racism. It's a measure called racial resentment, used very widely. But it doesn't sound like I don't like Black people, or I don't think Black people should have positions of power, or I don't think we should have policies that help Black people. It sounds like I just subscribe to these American values about working really hard and not expecting handouts.
So two more questions. I guess the first would be, I worry, my sense of the world, just living in the world as a Black person, I'm fairly confident these symbolic attitudes are affecting people in the world, affecting politics. I'm very skeptical when I see someone try to suggest economic data itself predicts elections. I'm very skeptical. That said, it also makes me a little worried. We now have had 2 presidential nominees of the last 3 who are women for the Democratic Party. Those 2 people lost. The 2 men both won. Is it if symbolic politics matters and we think there are certain people who are hiding maybe their racial, gender, maybe that they're more anti-gay, they're more anti-Muslim, they're more anti-woman, they're more anti-Black than we think they are. I guess I do worry to just end up with, do Democrats have to nominate a Joe Biden-like person every cycle? Like, and not, a person who is white, who is older, who is male, who is Catholic. You get the point I'm trying to make.
Mhm.
Is that if symbolic politics matters, what do we do about that?
Sure. I mean, I guess I would rebut by saying, two-term President Barack Obama, this is not an impossibility.
Right. He is Black,
Uh,
maybe not a woman, but is Black. Right. Fair enough. Yeah. Right.
right. I think, something that I subscribe to as a pollster, and this may surprise some people because we are sort of stereotyped to be very, so immersed in the data that we will just sort of recommend whatever polls well or whatever tests well. I don't subscribe to that as an approach writ large. Uh, I think that those arguments deeply underestimate the importance of an authentic and appealing candidate. The candidate really matters. So this idea that we just need to pick somebody kind of milquetoast who doesn't threaten anyone is, not a strategy that I would say the data supports, and also not something instinctively as a progressive that I think other progressives would fight for and get excited by. You have to be a good candidate. You have to appeal to people. You have to seem genuine. You have to have a forward-looking vision. You have to be perceived as some sort of correction to the problems that we have. And women are as capable of that as anybody else. So I think candidate appeal is the piece of that puzzle that we cannot underestimate.
Okay, so your answer in some ways previewed the next question, but I was going to ask about New York City and what we learned from that primary. I'm of the view that we don't. New York City is very unique compared to other places. Like you can't really run on rent stabilization or it wouldn't make much sense to run a little rent stabilization in Arkansas or you're in Idaho right now. I think that'd be. I assume people want lower rent, but I don't think that issue is as salient other places. New York City is more liberal, has more college graduates. Also running against someone who had, 12 or a large number of women accused them of improper behavior, as Andrew Cuomo was accused of, that might help a candidate. And the ranked choice voting also probably helped as well. So I'm of the view that there's not much to make from what happened, Mondani's victory. But tell me if I'm wrong about that, or if you think there is something to be learned from that.
I mean, I think there's always something to be learned from an election. The caution is always like not to extrapolate too much, right? This does not portend for Democrats nationwide in
Sure.
all contexts.
Okay.
New York City is its own ecosystem. What works in New York City would not necessarily work in Louisville. It certainly wouldn't work in Idaho. But I think that the importance of candidate authenticity is really on display in that particular election, and so much of the punditry that I've seen that is sort of taking aim at Mamdani and suggesting that he is somehow like a thorn in the Democrat side or a liability for us in terms of public narrative. So much of that I have read seems to focus on all of those sort of on paper characteristics that they think Democrats should be pivoting away from if they want to win back voters. I will say a couple of things about that. I mean, number one, it just ignores the fact that he is an incredibly charismatic, thoughtful communicator who is putting out real solutions to economic problems. He is speaking to those economic concerns in a way that proposes solutions that they are excited by. And he is a messenger that they find compelling and convincing. And that's not even taking into account the contrast with the other candidate. But, all of those sort of on paper problems that those narratives would like to suggest. All of that for me sort of dovetails with what I would consider to be a bad strategy or a sort of a strategy that's rooted in off-base perceptions about how to win voters back, because it all sort of suggests that we should be pivoting to the right wing, not even to the center, but like catering to the right wing in some way. And I really don't see the merit in that. I find that such a strange argument. For one thing, when the right loses elections, they never appeal to progressives. And it's because when you think about it that way, it sounds insane. Why would they do that? So why would we do that? So, if we're looking to appeal to voters that we have lost, there is oftentimes this assumption that we have to appeal to sort of the base of the other party and try to model ourselves a little bit in their image and find common ground with them. And I think that's very silly when we have a base of our own that we could connect to a little bit more organically. And we could speak to their concerns a little bit more effectively. I would also say I think it's rooted in what I would consider another off-base assumption, which is the idea that if we move to the middle, we persuade the middle and we retain the base. I have many concerns that is an inverted assumption. I think that moderating too often will alienate the base and fail to appeal to the middle, in no small part because it may seem inauthentic. Right? Like, why is a Democrat advocating some of these positions that I associate with the other party? I don't find that credible. I don't believe you. And if I wanted to vote for that, I have an option. He's right over there. Like if that's what I care about, I have a candidate already. So for multiple reasons, I would say we shouldn't extrapolate too much and say Mamdani's victory portends XYZ for Democrats in 2026 or 2028. It's about New York City. The lessons that I would extrapolate are candidate authenticity, first and foremost. Speak what you mean.
And the thing you said about the middle and the left makes me think that sort of saying defund the police may not be very useful, but saying I will increase this many police force this many ways may sound like, well, if I want a police candidate, I'll vote for the other team, which is very, very, is that sort of is that a good analogy here?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay. I'm gonna any final thoughts here? I think we've sort of circled around some of the same topics, but I want to any final thoughts about this kind of wokeness debate and like what's going on right now.
Again, I would just say that we shouldn't over-index on a one-point victory in
Okay.
2024 to suggest that Trump somehow has his finger on the pulse of true America. In some ways, that is sort of falling into a 6-decade-old trap for Democrats. What I would much prefer we do is advocate positions and policies that represent our values, not try to moderate those values based on concerns about election outcomes or poll results. Elected officials are public opinion leaders, and I think too often there is a tendency to sort of run a poll, assess where voters are, and decide to be that to appeal to them. That fundamentally misunderstands how the mass public comes to care about things in the first place. It is not always that grassroots. Very frequently, we care about what our elites that we trust tell us is important, and we tend to move our positions in line with people that we have chosen to trust and sort of delegate some of that big thinking to. I'm a Boston native. Elizabeth Warren will always be one of my political heroes. If she comes out with a position, instinctively, even as a person who, considers themselves fairly educated on these issues and would, sort of do some homework to figure out my own position, the moment that she comes out with a position on an issue, instinctively, based on the way that our brains work, I say that sounds like a good idea. So I would say sort of embrace the power that you have to make the things that you think should matter, because you have the ability to do that.
I'm glad you said that because we've seen this drop in support for Black Lives Matter. It's a poll. If you look at the polls, Black Lives Matter has low support. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I don't know that the American public has arrived with a more negative view about Black Lives Matter. It seems to me that in 2020, lots of elites in the media, in politics, are saying we have this huge problem with racial inequality in the country, and now either they're not saying that at all, or they're saying even worse that our attempts at racial equality have gone too far and we should pull back. And so I think the public is following, not necessarily leading that. I think that's often the case in issues. We act as if the poll is showing us something more, what is something that's not showing. We're going to wrap it there. I want to encourage people to read Lauren's Substack, which is called Mind the Gap. And she analyzes a lot of these issues and really brings a lot of great social science and research into it. And she's a pollster, but like she says, she's someone who reads beyond the poll and thinks beyond the poll, which is a great thing. So Lauren, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And that'll close up today's episode of Right Now with Perry Bacon.